I've been using golden open acrylics for over 10 years, and they changed the way that I think about acrylics. In this video, I use them to demonstrate how I paint this still life. Some of the techniques that I use would have been impossible with regular acrylics. At the end of the video, I answer some of the common questions people ask me about how to use open acrylics. There are timestamps in the description below, so you can jump to the information you're looking for. One technique that oil painters use is called a wipeout technique. That's where you stain the canvas with a color, then wipe away some of that color to create a drawing with various tools. So I'll squeeze out some of this burnt umber and I'll get started toning the panel. So I'll just scrub this on in a thin layer. You can even use like a rag to put it on. You can thin the paint with water, but you can also use open mediums. This is the acrylic matte medium. So I'll put a little bit of this on a palette. So that does make it a little bit easier to brush on. So I'll just scrub this on real quick and then I'll get started with the drawing. Here's my reference photo, and with this technique, you're actually drawing with the light areas. You can draw with different tools. There's like these color shapers that have a silicone tip. Then these tools are usually used for like modeling clay and stuff. This works best when the paint's first wet. You can see I can scratch a line into it. And here's the color shaper. You can just wipe away areas of color. As it dries, it gets harder to remove it, but you can re-wet it with like water. So I'll just put this line in here for the bottom of the wood table, and I'm looking at the basic shapes. For instance, this coffee mug isn't quite halfway over. I can see that it's a little bit more over to this side, and you could take measurements and you can see it's almost in the middle. It's off by a hair. You can make marks like that where, okay, this is like the halfway point, and I think the mug goes to about here. Using a smooth panel like this helps out because the paint wipes right off. You can do this technique on canvas too, but it's a little bit harder to remove the pigment. If these were regular acrylics, it would probably be tacked up already by now. Like I wouldn't be able to scratch into it as easily as I can with this. I've said this in other videos where it's tempting to draw like these shapes in here, the specular highlights, but it doesn't really make sense until you know you have the drawing somewhat accurate. See, this is starting to get a little bit fuzzy over here, so I could just like wipe that with a brush and then come back in and redo it. Like this negative shape in here is smaller than what I originally had. It's the same with the top of this. Like I think I have it too far up. I can feel that's tacking up a little bit, but I'm still able to remove it with the color shaper. A rag will work. It could be either wet or dry. A wet rag will definitely like take it back to the bare panel. So this is dry, and you can see that it lightens it up pretty well. And then here's a wet rag, and you can go back to the pure white if you want rather easily. You might be wondering how long you have to remove this. It really does depend on your studio conditions, like the temperature and the humidity. But this is from about 12 hours ago. It's mostly dry, but I can take a wet rag and remove some of that. So even though this is dry to the touch, it's not totally locked down. Acrylic paint first dries to the touch, and then it takes a while for it to actually like lock down and cure totally to where it has its full strength. And open acrylics take longer. So you could work on this drawing and come back the next day and still remove some of the paint if you wanted to. So I can remove some of the areas just to make this easier to read. There's also like shadows in here I didn't put in. There's a shadow here, and I can make this front section a little bit lighter. I think the spoon should be closer to the mug. There's some highlights in the background that I'll just sort of indicate. I always say work on the painting at any angle that you need to in order to get into the sections. You can also use Q-tips to work into the wet paint. This is dry and it does make it lighter, so that's for more subtle effects. If you need to remove more paint, you can just dip it in water and you can scrub it back to the white of the board. If you need to put more color in, you can also use a Q-tip. Underneath the spoon, I wanted to put a little bit of a shadow, so I'm just using the Q-tip to put that in. This was about 25 minutes, and I can still manipulate the paint. If this was regular acrylics, it would have been dry a long time ago, and you wouldn't be able to work back into it. Another benefit of using this wipeout technique is that it gives the whole canvas or panel a tone. It's like a tonal drawing rather than a line drawing, and it makes it seem like it's faster to put it in, and you don't get as bogged down in the details. I spent some time fixing the proportions. There's different ways to check to see if your drawing's accurate. In my last video about how to paint transparent glass, I used a grid to get the proportions more accurate. There's different what they call sighting techniques where even from life, you can hold a pencil up and measure the width of this coffee mug and compare it to the width of this plate and so on. I spent some time making this drawing more accurate by working into it with like wet Q-tips and applying a little bit more dark paint to paint over some areas. And it's mostly dry to the touch, but I think I might dry it with a hairdryer. That's one of the advantages of open acrylics is they do dry slower, but when you want to force dry them, you can do that. The hairdryer works really well on thin layers like this, so when I paint over it with wet paint, it should stick to it better. That's another issue with oils is if you put too much paint down, it's hard to get wet paint to stick to wet paint. So these are mostly 2-ounce tubes. Golden changed the caps to this notched shape, and it works really well with their tube opener. You can see there's notches in here, and it fits perfectly within these caps. So if you have a stuck cap, this tool will definitely help open it up. So the colors I'm using are phthalo blue. This is ultramarine blue. Cadmium yellow primrose. This is more opaque than the benzimidazoline yellow I normally use. Pyrola red. This pigment was also known as Ferrari red because it was a color that most Ferraris were painted back in the 1990s. Quinacridone magenta. I might use a little bit of cadmium orange for the wood color. I'll put some out there. And titanium white. These tube ringers really help because you can get every last ounce of paint out of a tube. So you can see how much that crimped it and pushed the paint up towards the top of the tube. One of the major advantages of open acrylics is that I don't have to mist them when they're on the palette. In my other videos where I use regular acrylics, I use a spray bottle like this to keep the paints wet while I'm working. Open acrylics will draw moisture out from the air and they'll stay wet for much longer than regular acrylics. While professional acrylics like this might be more expensive, it turns out that you end up wasting less of it because it doesn't dry up on your palette. I'll mix up some of these colors and then I'll start painting. So I figure I'd demonstrate how to mix this blue and maybe the color of the table. So I think the blue, this section would be more of the phthalo blue, and I think maybe a little bit more ultramarine in the darker sections. This is hard to judge because there's glare on here, but so I think it needs to go darker. So I'll add more phthalo blue into it. It's not too bad. I think maybe a little white towards the top would help. That's the thing is, I generally mix like the main colors. That's pretty good for the top edge. And then I go in and I adjust them as needed. So then I'll do this darker section, and I think for one, you just add less white to it. But I also think a little bit of magenta will make that more purple, and it'll make it a little bit darker. I do think it needs more white and more magenta. If I add a little bit of yellow to it, along with the magenta, it will make it duller. And I think that's closer to that color. It's interesting, you wouldn't think this blue would have yellow in it, but in combination with the magenta or even red, it makes the blue duller. I have an entire course about mixing colors, and there's a section in that course where I demonstrate how to neutralize colors and how to mix black and gray. So maybe I'll mix up the color of this cookie. It's a molasses cookie. I've got this burnt umber here and I want to use it up. So I'll just mix some cadmium orange into it. That's not too bad. I think a little bit of red. That's pretty good. I think it might need a little bit of white for these sections here, but this is a good place to start. I can add white, or I could add more blue to it to make it darker. So this is ultramarine blue. You can even add more red to it. So that works for like the darker shadow sections. This is a Masterson Stay Wet palette, and normally you put a thin sponge on the bottom, and on top of that goes this special palette paper. And that allows you to squeeze regular acrylics out onto it, and it absorbs moisture from the sponge. And your paints will stay wet for days that way. But with open acrylics, you don't need the sponge. Once you put the lid on there, you can see there's a groove along the outside, and it snaps down around the edge, and that forms an airtight seal. And I've left open acrylics in here for weeks, and when I open it back up, they're still wet. This is actually a glass cutting board in here. I find that it's less expensive than like a palette that's made for painting, and the edges are also rounded for safety reasons. One way to keep the moisture up inside is to spray the lid lightly before you close it, and you could put a damp sponge like off in the corner, and that will help to keep the humidity up. So I find that this is a game changer for palette management. Another thing is I don't worry about how much paint I squeeze out, because when I'm done, I just scrape it all up and mix it together and store it in an airtight container. I have an entire video in the description below about how I set this up. I think I'll start by painting the background around the coffee mug. I'm starting with this medium blue. I'm just gonna put some color around the mug, and I might dip into some of this darker color because that section does sort of bleed into that. There's like a window pattern, so I'm just putting those darker sections in now. With open acrylics, you don't want to paint too thick because it will take too long to dry. Golden recommends not painting thicker than like 1/16 of an inch, which is about the thickness of a penny. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is. If you paint that thick, you can get like texture in your paintings. Once you get the feel for how thick you need to go, it just becomes second nature. So blending is easier with these. I'm just mixing these two colors together a little bit, and you can see there's a difference there. It's a little bit lighter. Maybe that's a little bit too light for that section. I'll go up here. You can see that this edge is starting to get soft already, and I really didn't blend it too much. You can read up on open acrylics on the Golden website. They talk about how it goes through different drying stages, where at first it's a little bit slick, and then as it starts to dry a little bit, it gets a little bit more tacky, and there's like this sweet spot where it becomes easier to blend. There's a little chunk of paint in there. It happens, you get little chunks of paint in there and you just peel them out. I should remind myself to mix more color when I get started, because I'm kind of running out already. It took some time to mix up more of this color. This paint is still wet, even though regular acrylics would have been dry by now. And I could feel this is a little bit more tacky, and it kind of helps with blending because it doesn't slide around as much. This is a softer mop brush that I use for watercolors, but the bristles are nice for blending. So I just do some circular motions and then some back and forth motions. I'm just going to focus on this section first. That's another blending tip with acrylics, is to work on the painting in sections. That way you can blend it while it's still wet. I'm feeling like this is too quick of a transition, so I'm pulling some of the darker color into the lighter sections. Then I go straight back and forth like this. So I can pull some of this dark color over here, and then go back and forth. You can also blend with a nylon brush. It's easier to like push the paint around with it because the bristles are a little bit stiffer. You can always go back into like the lighter sections and just reinforce how light it is. So this transition area is about the same shade as this, so I'm doing them at the same time. Then I can work over into the darker colors. I'm going to start on the mug, and I'll do the inside of it first. That looks like black on screen, but there's color in there. It's kind of like a muted purple. I'll mix it from ultramarine blue and some quinacridone magenta. That makes a purplish color. To make that darker and duller, you would add yellow, but this cadmium yellow is too opaque. It will lighten the color. This is benzimidazolone yellow medium. This is what Golden replaced Hansa yellow with. They're pretty similar, but what I'm looking for is a transparent yellow. You can see it's a little bit more orange than the cadmium yellow primrose, but that's not going to matter here. If I add a little bit in there, it looks less purple. It's kind of hard to see that. If I add white to it, you would notice it. Painting ellipses is pretty tricky because they have to be symmetrical or else it doesn't look right. You also need the right curve on both sides of it. It usually takes a little bit of finessing to get it to look right. Sometimes you gotta go back in with the background color just to fix it. And where it ends is kind of tricky. You gotta make that look rounded without being too round. I'm painting it a little bit wider than what I think I need because I can come back in with the rim color and fix it. There's like this highlight in the middle too. I'm trying to preserve that. And the dark color does start at the top of the mug. It might be a little bit more blue, so I can just work some ultramarine in there. This mug also has like a glaze on it with all these speckles in here. I'm not sure how I'm going to paint that. I could paint it mostly this dark color, let it dry, and then come back in and sort of dab on a lighter blue color. I might try that out and then see how that works. And I don't think this is pure white. I could probably add a little bit of color in there. So I'll block in this dark color, and maybe I'll lighten it as it goes down, but then I'll have to come back in, like I said, and put that texture in there. And the thing is, a lot of times I have to figure these things out as I'm painting it. It's not as if I know exactly how to do this when I begin. So I'm going to experiment a little bit here. And I can put some of that lighter color in there. Maybe if I take a smaller brush. Oh, this brush needs to be cleaned. So this brush had some dry paint in there, and I used Masterson brush soap to remove it. I made a short video on how to remove dry paint using Masterson soap. There's a link to it in the description below. And that's the advantage of open acrylics, is that if you leave your brushes overnight and you forget to clean them, you can salvage them easier because the paint isn't totally cured yet. Even if it starts to set up a little bit, it's much easier to remove than regular acrylics. And that's because regular acrylics will cure faster. I'm going to experiment with trying to replicate that texture. I'm putting in the light blue, and then I think I can put in the dark blue around it. I mixed up the lighter blue on the side here. I added a little bit of white to it and some quinacridone magenta. I'm thinking if I just dab it in there and then work around it with a darker color, I think maybe that'll help soften the edges. You could just paint this a solid blue, but I kind of want to replicate the look of like a glossy ceramic mug that has like variation in it. If I wasn't a painter, I'd probably try pottery because it is appealing to me, the color and the different glazes you can achieve. I'm going to put this white section in here so I could judge this darker area better. It's mostly white, and I think even just the leftover color in my brush might be good enough. It looks a little too purple. It's kind of like a grayish color. I'll put that in there. I think this effect will work, so I'll put in the rest of it. I've been working on this for a while, and this paint is still wet. So I could take a soft brush and sort of blur some of these areas so it doesn't look so fussy. If these were regular acrylics, you wouldn't be able to do this. This would all be dry. That's what I like about these paints, is it gives you time to play around with like textures. So I can soften some areas and then come back and put some more sharp areas on top of it. There are a few areas that are a little bit tacky, like I noticed here, it's a little bit tacky. But what you can do is use some of this open thinner to reactivate the paint. I can put a small drop on my palette and dip my brush into it. There's no binder in here, so you really don't want to use a ton of this in your painting, but you can use it to reactivate areas. So now I can work this section if I want to. So I just want to put some streaks in here, and I'll come back and put some more detail into it. I don't like completely finishing an area before I have all the colors kind of blocked in. So I'm going to take some time and block in some of these background colors. This blue background is tacky, but I think I could soften it up by using some of this open thinner. I think if I wipe off some of the paint and pick up some of the open thinner, I could work it into the blue area and loosen it up. So I was able to create like a soft edge here, even though the blue is pretty tacky and almost dry. There are some subtle color changes that happen on the wood table. For instance, I added a little bit of red to the main color so that it gets a little bit more reddish as it approaches the shadow area. I can add a little bit of blue to make that go darker. So that would be for this area back here. I'm going to take a walk and have lunch. So I'll just spray this lid and put it on top and make sure it's sealed, and that'll keep the paint wet. I mixed up some of the grays for the spoon, so I'm going to paint that in. I'll start with the dark color, and then I'll go back in and put in some of the highlights. I want to make sure I have the shape right before I continue to put in all the detail. After that, I'll probably put in the cookie color and then the front edge of the wood table. I've got two colors for the cookie. There's a dark color, then the main color for the body of the cookie. This one was a molasses cookie and this was peanut butter, but I think I'm going to make both of them this darker brown color. I think it goes nice with the blue. And I can also mix some of those together to get like the in-between shades. The edge of the plate is almost pure white. So what makes it stand out is these colors are darker than you think they are. So when you put the highlight color in here, it does pop a little bit more. And it helps to use a wood stick to keep your hand off the paint. That's one thing I had to get used to with open acrylics. And that's the idea that the paint stays wet for quite a while. Like I painted this earlier this morning and I could see that this blue is still tacky. With regular acrylics, it dries within like 10 minutes and you can rest your hand on there and steady your hand that way. But this is almost like working with oils where you have to learn how to steady your hand using like a mahlstick or just even a paint stirring stick like this. I let this painting dry overnight. It's pretty much dry to the touch. The blue part is a little bit tacky. Maybe a little bit of color came off there. So I have all the colors blocked in. From here, it's mostly refining. So things I'm noticing when I was looking at it yesterday. So the bottom of this coffee mug handle, I feel like it's a little bit too far to the left. One trick you can do is like create a plumb line, like a totally vertical line. And you can see the top of the handle is a little bit more to the right. I think I have it too far over. Like I think the bottom of the handle should be more over like here. So I might just paint that in on the bottom. I feel like I could refine the texture on the mug a little bit more. I might rework the background to make it smoother. The second coat usually goes on better because if you have any streaks, you have the previous layer showing through and not like the white of the board. So I might not show all the steps. I might just like gloss over some of it, but that's the plan that I have for the rest of the painting. You can also use open thinner to make paint on your palette a little less tacky. So some of these thin areas on here are a little bit tacky, and if I just put a dash in there, it does loosen it up. So that's another way that you can save paint with open acrylics. I'm adding a second layer to the background. I already brushed on some of the dark blue. Now I'm adding in the lighter blue. This mop brush has soft bristles, but they're also shorter. That allows me to push the paint around a little bit more. This is the stage when I really put some effort into blending these background colors. So I'm trying to blend this background in here, and this is tacking up. That's where the open thinner comes in handy. I put a little on my brush and work it into this area, and it loosens it up a bit. So now I can just rework that area and it will smooth out rather than look streaky. So I redid this dark section here, and by the time I got around to this light blue section, it started to tack up, and just adding that little bit of open thinner allows me to work it back in there. I'm thinking about adding like a wood grain effect to the front of this. One way to do that is to glaze over transparent colors. I have the open acrylic gloss medium, and there's also a matte version. I mixed up this brown color and then I added a lot of the medium to it so it's transparent. That way I can paint it on and create subtle wood grain effects. If I don't like how it works, I could take a wet rag and wipe it off like I did for the wipeout method in the beginning. It's just a matter of picking up some of the transparent pigment and brushing it on. I can also like wipe off my brush, pick up more of the medium, and work it in here. Scrubbing gel in here sort of reactivates the paint. That way I can push it around and get the effect I'm looking for. I can also take a larger brush and wipe some of it off. Another way to cut through that is to use some water. It's an easy way to lift off some of the pigment. I can also take a little bit of white and add it to the medium, make sure it's mixed in, and use that to create, that's probably a little bit too much white in there. You can create like subtle highlight effects. And the neat thing about that is it retains the texture underneath. Here are some of the common questions people ask me about open acrylics. The most common one is, how long does it take for them to dry? That's kind of a difficult question to answer because it depends upon your environment. The drying times of acrylic paints are affected by the temperature, humidity, airflow, and the thickness of the application. So what I get here in Buffalo would be different than if you paint in Arizona. It's definitely different if you paint outside under sunlight. But let's take a look at the information that Golden has on their website. They state that the working time of open acrylics is approximately 10 times longer than usual acrylic paints. And they provide a table below that. In the top row, they state that open acrylics are wet for 30 to 60 minutes, and they're workable for 1 to 3 hours. They can be reopened up to 12 hours later, which I proved at the beginning of this video when I wiped away some of that burnt umber that had been drying overnight. In the row below that, they show that heavy body acrylics stay wet for about 5 minutes, and they remain workable for up to 10 minutes. That's a dramatic difference. You have much more time to blend open acrylics than you do regular acrylics. And in the bottom row is a mixture of 50% open acrylics with 50% heavy body acrylics. That mixture stays wet for about 10 to 20 minutes, and it will be workable for about 15 to 30 minutes. I don't really mix regular acrylics with open acrylics. I don't see the advantage of that. It makes them dry slower. Although if you're trying to use up your old regular acrylics because you're switching over to open acrylics, it does make sense to mix them in so you can use them up. But other than that, if I want open acrylics to dry faster, I just use a hairdryer. Now that leads to the next question about, can you layer open acrylics with faster drying regular acrylics? And the answer is you can, but it's a little bit trickier because you don't want to paint a fast drying layer over open acrylics before they had a chance to dry. So on their site, it states not to apply thick films of faster drying gels on top of applications of open acrylics without waiting a minimum of 2 weeks after being touch dry. And they go on to state that this period is needed to avoid the volatile materials from getting trapped underneath the faster drying layer. And that can cause the layer to become cloudy or hazy. So I feel like if you want to use both systems, I would recommend painting the regular acrylics for the underpainting because they dry really fast, and then use open acrylics on top of that so you can achieve smoother blends and soft edges and things like that. How thick can you apply open acrylics? They recommend not going any thicker than 1/16 of an inch because it'll take a long time to dry or it might remain tacky for quite a bit. That might not sound like a lot, but it's actually the thickness of a penny. And when you apply paint that thick on a canvas, it does create some texture. The other thing you can do is layer modeling paste or even regular gels or acrylic paints as an underlayer to create texture, and then paint with open acrylics on top of it. You might be wondering if open acrylics are the same thing as regular acrylics with retarder added to it. I would say no. In my experience, open acrylics stay wet much longer than regular acrylics with retarder gel added to it. In a previous video, I used retarder to paint a background, and it does extend the drying time, but it's not as much as open acrylics. Plus, I like the convenience of having tubes of paint with retarders already added to it, and I just find it works better than the retarder added to regular acrylics. I find the viscosity of open acrylics are a little bit different. It seems like they're gooier. That's the only word I can think to describe them. It's not the same thing as like heavy body with retarder added to it. Are open acrylics the same thing as painting with oils? I would say no. It's a different experience, and I'd also say that they're different than regular acrylics. I feel like open acrylics allow me to blend a layer much longer than regular acrylics, but they dry faster than oils, which is actually a convenience because sometimes I find that I'm waiting around for an oil painting to dry to put another layer on there and I get impatient. The other thing too is it feels a little bit different than oils, and it goes through different drying stages. They mention that on their website. They talk about finding that sweet spot where it starts to tack up a little bit. It's a little bit tacky. I don't know, it's hard to describe. Oil painting can be a little bit more technical because you have to follow the fat over lean principle, which means the first layer shouldn't have much oil in it at all, and each additional layer should have increasing amounts of oil in it. And that's so that the first layers dry faster than the outer layers, and that prevents cracking. With acrylics, you don't worry about that at all. Up next, you can watch more of my in-depth acrylic painting tutorials, such as my video about how to blend student acrylics like oils, or my other video about how to paint the illusion of transparent glass. Thanks for watching.